Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to all of you for our next session on Security Europe. Mary Fitzgerald and I will co-moderate, and you also see, as you've seen in your program on the stage, Ian Burema, Salih Ben Ali, and Stefano Manservisi. Mary and I have 2 minutes to kick off. As I said, we have a very wide range of subjects to discuss. And we would like to have this session not so much in a Q&A format, but more, and let's try to do our best as a brainstorm. Let me kick off by very briefly mention a few subjects. First of all, continuing the interesting discussion we had this morning on the refugee crisis. Question, is a European Union which does not control its external borders in a position to continue with Schengen and Dublin II? And what should be done? And Commissioner Timmermans made a few remarks about it this morning about protection of our external borders. That's point number one. Point number two, in the refugee crisis, I think, let's keep it a debate where we answer moral questions, questions of a moral and humanitarian nature. And let's not complicate the debate by saying we need those people because they are highly educated. I mean, that's also a debate, but that's more a migration debate and not that much a refugees debate or an asylum debate. Three, to stay on the moral side, we have to answer a number of nagging questions, which were also discussed this morning. On numbers of refugees any society can receive without being overburdened. It is a question politicians do not like to ask, but we should do that here. And when I say this, we should, I think, not leave it to fringe parties or populist parties, this debate, because they have the floor. And I think that across Europe, the mainstream political parties, I may use that expression, have a special responsibility. So much about the refugee crisis. My second and final point is on the global and regional priorities of the European Union, which is, of course, very much part of the strategy High Rep Mogherini is developing. I think she needs all the support she can get, and we have an expert in the panel this afternoon, but she also very much needs the support of national capitals. And that remains to be seen. I think she needs that support. But that project will fail if the European Union will remain the soft power champion and will not be ready and willing and able, if necessary, and as a weapon of last resort, to project hard power. In other words, to have a real defense and security policy. I realize this is a sequel of a common foreign policy, but nevertheless, short of Article 5 and NATO debates, I think the European Union is before a fork in the road where there will be a decision what kind of union it will be. And for that to happen, of course, nation states, the members of the European Union, should turn the tide of the permanent defense budget cuts because it doesn't make much sense to develop a strategy which does not have the substance to implement it when it is necessary. Where were the European battle groups when there was a talk of an intervention in Mali? I'll stop here. There's much more to say, but I'll pass the floor to my co-moderator, Mary Fitzgerald. Mary.
Thank you, Jaap. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to put a few things out there in terms of getting people in the room thinking about particular questions related to this topic before we hear from the discussants. And those of you who were at the session earlier today on recovering the EU's global influence will have heard some pretty acerbic criticism of the neighbourhood policy, which, as we know, is under review at the moment. One of the attendees, one of the speakers at that session, indeed, referred to the review as simply a cosmetic lift of a long failing policy. So I think we need to think a little bit more about the EU neighbourhood policy. Is it fit for purpose? Is it no longer fit for purpose? What would a neighbourhood policy that is fit for purpose look like? Because, as we know, the neighbourhood, the European neighbourhood has changed dramatically over the last 4 years. Related to that is the question of how Europe balances realpolitik when it comes to the hard realities of its neighbourhood right now with the aspirations and values that we see encapsulated in our neighbourhood policy as it exists at the moment. Is it possible to have a balance of the two? I would also ask you to think about something that we all know is a conundrum that's at the heart of EU policy more generally, but I think is most obvious when it comes to the idea of forging a common EU foreign policy. The tension that exists between member states' interests and the challenge of forging a common policy. My area of specialization is Libya since 2011, and I have seen on the ground in Libya during its very, very turbulent transition how key EU member states competed fiercely with each other to the detriment of a common European policy on Libya. Now, because Libya has been plunged into such a crisis over the last year, we see some coming together of those member states in trying to tackle the crisis there. But still, that issue of member states' interests, the relations between member states and external actors who are backing certain factions in Libya remains key. So I'd like you to think a little bit more about that, how we balance individual member states' interests with the idea of a common EU policy when it comes to the neighbourhood. So I'll leave you with those questions, just to mull over those questions and contribute to a fruitful discussion later on. Thank you.
Then I would like to ask Salia Ben Ali, please, your story, very personal story.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Friends of Europe for their invitation and the opportunity to be with you here today. Then my name is Salia Ben Ali. I'm a mother of 4 children, and I worked for 20 years as social worker. My second son, Sabri, went to Syria when he was 19. It was in 2013. He said, "We must help the Syrians because nobody helped them." He never returned. Sabri died few months later. After his departure, I worked to understand the mechanism that influenced my son to live and choose to die as martyr. I wanted to prevent other innocents from sacrifice themselves in this goal. First, by participating in discussion groups with other parents concerned by the departure of one of their child to a war zone. 2, I pushed all political doors to make finally hear the voice of parents, especially mothers, to make them understand that we are not terrorist moms, but victims. Mothers must be heard, included, and supported as partners in security strategies and solutions. Mothers request the support of national networks and international platforms that provide support and space to channel their inputs into the build-up of a new security paradigm that includes civil society. Mothers should be provided with tailored trainings to strengthen their know-how and confidence to play a role in their homes and communities as early detection and intervention systems. Mothers need to be involved and included in security policy meetings to share and inform national strategic prevention mechanisms. Mothers welcome role models and mentorship programs for disoriented and vulnerable youth. Mothers need to bring the stories of disillusioned and disappointed voices from the front lines to reframe and challenge the grasp of recruiters. Mothers can be emotional lifeline and driving force for rehabilitation for those returning. By creating Safe Belgium, I wanted to give more power in this process of change by connecting all actors in society, schools, parents, local administrations, social workers, imams, former jihadists, and all the goodwill to create a supportive and dynamic network. The missions of Save Belgium are fighting against radical mind in an exchange of practices on prevention, awareness and training for those involved in the front line. The program will be designed by SAVE in partnership with existing educational and scientific groups. Combating discrimination to allow forming a civic, social, and inclusive identity. Fight against hate speeches, but also against the hate propaganda on internet and social networks, mainly frequented by youth. Discussion groups with parents, but also with young people affected by departures in war zone of the tragic loss of a loved one. Debates and conference on prevention and radicalism. With the NGO Women Without Borders in Vienna, we just launched the first European model school in Belgium. This is a global movement against extremism, strengthening confidence and competence, empowering mothers to rise against radicalization, building a first line of defense. The challenge was launched, and all together, at our level, we can do it. I will conclude by quoting l'Abbé Pierre. We cannot, under the pretext that it is impossible to do everything in one day, doing nothing at all. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I feel a bit diffident talking about, taking up the question raised by Frans Timmermans this morning. What is it that drives young people to supporting a death cult? After hearing this, because I can only speculate, I have no personal involvement. I think what is happening, in a nutshell, is why is violent Islam attractive? In a nutshell, political Islam began as a rebellion against secular police states in the Middle East. And this has created a ready-made cause for disaffected, disillusioned, vulnerable, confused youths in Europe and other parts of the Western world. That explains, I think, much more than any reading of the Quran why Islam is attractive and, say, not Hinduism or Buddhism or forms of Christianity. It's a revolutionary movement that makes people feel empowered, that gives them a sense of purpose, a great cause, and so on, always attractive to vulnerable young people. And the tragedy of our time is that there is this ready-made cause for a particular segment of our population. Therefore, I think to try and understand this, it's not really very useful to read the Quran or to treat it as a theological problem. It's not fundamentally a theological problem, it's a socio-political problem. If we see it as a theological problem and see Islam as inherently prone to this kind of violence, not only do I think it's intellectually wrong, I think it also risks alienating the majority of law-abiding Muslim Europeans whose support we need, not least for intelligence and so on, in order to try and contain the violence that is the result of this. Now, preaching tolerance, anti-racism and so on at schools and in education in general is a fine thing, and I wouldn't be against it, but I don't think that's the solution either. First of all, a lot of the young people who are attracted to a violent cause are not necessarily idealists or well-informed ideologues. There are psychological reasons why people do this. In many ways, it's more useful to read Joseph Conrad's novels about anarchists going around London with ticking bombs in their raincoats than it is to read the Quran. I mean, and you can't always, you certainly won't prevent youths like that joining a movement by having fine programs preaching tolerance and anti-racism. Families are, of course, another reason. Dysfunctional families, families that are oppressive to daughters, that have sons that get out of control and so on, are also, of course, a problem. But there I think there always has to be a very careful balance. in what the state can actually do to prevent violence emerging from family situations and where they should intervene. The one area where I think different states can do something, I'm not sure about the EU, but I think this is something for individual nation states, is employment. And I think as long as in France, for example, I mean, different countries have different situations, but in France, for example, if your name happens to be Mohammed or Ahmed, and you're living in a banlieue of a big city, your chances of getting employment, because of the nature of the French system and so on, are bleak, and that can only contribute to the problems that we're talking about. In Britain, deliberate efforts to make it hard for people in refugee camps to find work, I think, again, can only have a deleterious effect as a result of this. So I will really, I haven't finished my 5 minutes, it was probably to your relief. So I'll finish with that. I think that what we need is very practical measures to promote integration of minorities, but no method is going to be fail-safe. The Conradian, nihilistic types will get through, and that's a matter for the police. Thank you.
Stefano Mastrorini.
Thank you. Since I think the center of gravity of our being here today is more in the question and answer, I mean, it'll be not only short in the 5 minutes, but also try to present in 5 minutes 5 points, which could be a reference for the debate afterward. First, our global strategy for foreign policy and security, I think, is something which is floating around in order to understand it better. I would like simply to be very, very short and concrete, to draw your attention on the 3 main concepts which are at the beginning of the strategy. We are living in a more connected, in a more contested, in a more complex world. All this is not only, let's say, maybe a beautiful analysis of what it is, but it is an indication on what the Europe could be or could do in an area in which we cannot, let's say, separate component of crisis. We cannot separate component of our action, but we must be able also to deal with each of them. It is a strategy which should first, in its first part, to identify what Europe has done so far with the means it has, what has been our success, what are the instruments, and then in the second part, the one which should be presented later next year to the European Council, is rather, let's say, a sort of mix of analysis and framework for action, having in mind these 3 elements: connected, contested, and complex, meaning that difficult to separate, second, a world which is living in conflict, and third, in a world which is without a governance, because the multilateralism is at the very best under threat. Point number 2, the region around us. I think that this is the best example of connected, contested, and complex. Connected because there is no element of the framework, of the regional framework in which we are working, which is not finding a connection with elsewhere in the world, being terrorism, being refugees, being migration, being wars, proxy wars and others. And therefore, I think that we are facing here in the region a test for these 3 concepts. Is contested because you see every day what it means. We are living in an area which is the most turbulent in the world in terms of conflict. And it is complex because it is far from having any kind of governance, including on respecting the most elementary existing rule of international law, like, for example, east of Ukraine or the annexion of Crimea. So therefore, we are to apply our grille de lecture, or our approach to our region in order to identify what to do. Here, the neighbourhood policy has been quoted several times. Obviously, we have to reform it completely. It's not a question just to end up with the Eurocentrism, which has been a bit candidly inspired what we have done over the years, but it's simply a question to identify what our interest, is our capacity to attract the countries which are around us in a fair and quite different deal in order to find common interest with each of them. And in order to use all the instruments that we have in a different way, because so far we were using a sort of enlargement approach, now we have to change radically and to use a foreign policy approach, which is federating instrument according to the needs, according to our interest. Point number 3 is terrorism. I don't want to let's say, add anything to personal, let's say, testimonies which are particularly important in terms to identify the fact that the terrorism, violent extremism, is not an external factor. It's a factor which is produced by our societies too. Is produced by the contradictions that we're bringing, and this will precisely suggest solutions which are not just public order, which are not just border management, are also public order, border management, but which have to deal with the transformation of the countries around us, with the let's say, the way to accommodate our values, which remains, but also values of those which are around us, which are still inspired by ours, but we are not ready to take it over. I used to remember that after the Charles Hebdo attack, you know, there was a strong movement on Je suis Charlie, but there was an equal strong movement on the other side of the sea, Je ne suis pas Charlie. And I think that we have to consider this carefully and to understand what it means if we want to be able to address this issue. Fourth point is about migration and refugees. This will take a long hour of discussion at the very best. I think that here we have two things. First, to be a bit more confident in ourselves, because we are talking about a serious problem. But 2 days ago I was in Ethiopia. We were talking about how Ethiopia can help the powerful and rich European Union. The Ethiopians said, we are more than keen to help you because we see that you are under stress. By the way, we have a certain experience because in Ethiopia there are 700,000 refugees. Therefore, you know, it's sometimes difficult to explain to poor countries like Ethiopia that the powerful Europe is under stress because of less than 700,000 refugees. But we have to manage it, because if we don't do it properly, then our public opinion will simply don't understand. But let's have in mind the elements of this so-called crisis in order then to prepare the future. And again, the future is not of public order, border management, is of integration, because we all know that the European society will need more migrant and not less in the future. Last point is about ourselves. I think that I limit myself to one point. We often say to build up a common foreign policy, we need to address the dramatic diversity of interest between our member state and the Union. Well, allow me to say that in all the most difficult theaters in which we are trying to build up a EU position, in reality, the interests are converging. It is matter also to be able to, say, find out a way to identify this and to create a condition to bring them forward. But at the bottom, in fact, the interests are much more converging. Are our institutions, our rules able to facilitate this consolidation? This maybe is not the case. But I don't want now to open a chapter of the new treaty. Let's remain with what we have. I think that we have instrument enough in order to be able, if politics is wise, to emerge consensual. I can give a lot of examples in our discussion, and then to bring not just a static interest of definition, but then an action. And this is much more difficult. The interest definition is much more converging than one can believe, but then to translate that into action, and therefore the mix, soft and hard power that we have, this is the real challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. If I could just follow up with a question to you. I mean, you mentioned the 3 C's, complex, connected, and contested. I would ask a question related to another C word, containment, or the question of containment, the impossibility of containment. You know, there was a time when we heard the word containment a lot. Indeed, I still hear it from Western officials when it comes to the crisis in Libya. It could be argued that the idea or the notion of crisis on Europe's door being contained is being challenged like never before because of the reasons you outlined, particularly the interconnectedness of so many of those crises. Are we in danger of Europe right now of focusing too much on the symptoms of these crises and not the actual causes, whether we're dealing with the refugee crisis or whether we're dealing with the security challenges?
No, I think that what we are doing is trying to address both the root causes and the phenomenon which is more short-term. The problem is also that, you know, whatever politician in the European Union now is living under the pressure of the short-term solution which are supposed to solve problem in a few days, because this is the tendency of the public opinion, this is what the media is requiring, this is what people are requiring, very much simple. So let's say there is a question of challenge of leadership in the European Union level in order to manage the short term and the long term, which is not an easy challenge, but this is what we are facing every day. Now, in real terms, what we are doing, you have seen, for example, recently in the eastern route, for example, of refugees. There is obviously an issue of respecting the European rules, first and foremost, because they are existing. We say that we're living in a rule of law in union. Let's call member states in respecting the rules. Second, let's call member states in respecting what is our philosophy, responsibility, cohesion, help to each other. I mean, and therefore, this is something where, you know, I think solidarity should come up a bit more, because otherwise there will be no solution. Third, we have to manage our borders, as a matter of fact. If we don't manage our border in a credible way, our people simply not follow, because the issue of freedom is now much more shadowed by the fact that there is no freedom if every day I'm under threat of people which are arriving that are not entitled to, etc. And then all the narrative. So therefore, we have to do it. But at the same time, in particular linked to the situation in Africa, if we are talking about the central route, or in Syria, which is the source of the eastern route, we are doing something in the sense of first building the alliance with Turkey through the action plan, etc., in order to have this big country being on the same, let's say, attitude that we have. But second, also starting, and you have seen the conclusion of the Foreign Affairs Council of the last one, on what we can do on Syria. And we have defined a common position to work in the UN framework, which is putting together two aspects. One, we need to be united in fighting against terrorism, Daesh and others, and in this, the regime has a role to play. And in the political solution, which is the transition, in which also the regime has inevitably a place, but will not be part of the ending solution. Therefore, we have to, let's say, build on this in order to be more active. But it is obvious that this is not easy, because to remain united, you must remain in the framework of the UN. We are supporting and working with Staffan de Mistura, but it's also obvious that, in particular, after the intervention of Russia, things are getting more complicated. But we are addressing also this, but nobody can believe that this will have the magic solution in order to stop the flows.
All right, thank you so much. We now go to the floor, and we said it's going to be as interactive as possible. You've heard 4 comments, so now the floor is open. By exception, to make it interactive, Mary and I will allow an interruption here or there, but it does not mean interactivity and more comments and Q&A that everyone who wants to intervene takes 10 minutes. I mean, we'll make sure that that does not happen. Who is the first? Who is going to kick off our debate? Not all this at the same time. Please, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
Aris Kokinos, journalist for a website called euroball.com. A question for Mary. In the war in Libya, can you tell us what has been achieved, finally, with the 2 governments now, with oil at record low, with migrants arriving, with all that chaos there? Economically, what has been achieved for Europe with the French and British intervention mainly?
Okay, we'll take a few. I think I say Stefan Fülle. Please, Stefan.
Thanks, Jaap, indeed. Could panelists comment the following extremely short point? First, we shouldn't blame us on every bad things happening around us. There is a bigger competition, and we should be aware sort of that the more we involve the conditionality, the better we work. Where there is no conditionality, I don't see really the instruments to influence the things. So there's this first element. There's not that much we can do. The second point is we could always combine, we could have a soft power, which is about example, or a hard power, which is about enforcement. We could combine it, but there is nothing in between. In other words, the way we organize ourselves, the way we are sort of a beacon of hope, an example, is how the neighborhood could follow us. The third point is the CFSP versus member states. Shouldn't we change the perception? And I think Mary made that point, that the member states, for them, the CFSP is whenever they are in Brussels, have a meeting and adopt a declaration. When they sort of go then to their capitals, they pursue with their foreign ministry their own member states. So I would say we don't have one CFSP. We have 29 foreign policies, 1 CFSP and 28 of member states. And my last point is, how in this new document is going to be this relationship between values and interest reflected? I thought that one of the lessons learned of Jasmine Revolution and us paying the price to have the deal with the dictators is that we should follow the strict balance between the values and interest and not to divide them again. Thank you.
Could I solicit a German view, a view from Germany on the discussion about soft and hard power, as Stefan Fiedler was also referring to? Is there any German comment on this issue? I'm afraid there isn't. Okay. Isn't it? Yeah? Please. Please.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sitting...
Microphone is coming there.
Oh, sorry, easier. Thank you. Franziska Brandner, member of the German Bundestag. So if you're speaking about the German position, I'm not the government position, but I think there is overall difficulty in seeing how to deal with the current situation and how to strike this balance that, Stefan, you were just mentioning. It's a very difficult one, and I have the impression that we're going back in the pendulum back to just seeing interests in quotation marks, because I'm not even sure that they serve our interests. And so my fear is that we're going, maybe, we went all the way to the side and now we're going back all the other way and don't find the middle. And I'm afraid that the strategy, as far as I've seen it, is also doing the shift back to the old policies. And that would be a bit my question, in terms of if you would have to find some conditions related to human rights, and if they're not, the highest standards like Norway, what would be your benchmark? I think one, for example, could always be that these countries have to accept that you finance civil society actors, because that's one thing where we see closing down in the entire region and laws against financing of civil society actors. That could be one very easy, when you say, look, that's the minimum condition for getting EU funding, is that you allow us also to fund some civil society organizations. So in that direction, where is your thinking about what conditions make sense? How do you want to defend it without going back to the old model?
One more comment from the floor, perhaps. Yes, sir. You should push the button.
Oh, sorry. Frédéric Vallier, Secretary General of the Council of European Municipalities and Regions and Vice President of European Movement International. I have two questions. One is about the state of crisis and emergency that you mentioned. How is it that we always have the feeling that we are reacting to emergency crisis? When we think about the refugee crisis, one can think that this was going to come up. And suddenly it seems like we are in that state of emergency that we don't know how to deal with that problem. And I would like to refer to past crises. In the 70s, for example, when we had boat people coming from Southeast Asia, I think France hosted something like 300,000 in a couple of years, or even less, and it didn't seem to be a problem. And now it's a tremendous problem to organize for 24,000 in France. So it's very strange. And if we go even further, my father was born in Algeria, and in '63, France had to host 1 million refugees, French refugees from Algeria in 3 months. And well, it was not always very welcome, but it worked. So that's just a question. And that's true for the, of course, for the refugee crisis, but also for the situation in the Mediterranean. I don't know if someone saw that the Arab Spring was going to come up, but it seems like it's always a surprise to us Europeans that something is happening in our neighborhood. And the other thing, referring to the refugee crisis, I have the feeling as Secretary General of CMR that the European Union and the member states are always discussing between each other to try to solve problems when they should open themselves to other actors. And just one last comment. We have in the European Union 100,000 municipalities. My president the other day said at the European Parliament, just imagine that 2/3 of those would volunteer to host 2 or 3 families of refugees. We would be much further the numbers that are addressed at the European level. Thank you.
Thank you. If we turn to Ian then, Ian, if you'd like to respond to some of those points.
Well, I'll respond to one of them about European values, which is something that's being constantly talked about, and interests. When people talk about European values, it's always rather unclear to me what they mean. I mean, there are the values of the Enlightenment and Judeo-Christianity, Greece, and so on and so forth. I think what people often talk about is post-war European values, European between quotation marks. And one of them, Germany, I think, is very relevant to this. And those European values mean peace, negotiation, compromise, renouncing war, and so on. Very fine values, but we can only pride ourselves on these values because we leave it up to the Americans to do the hard stuff. And I think the dependency on the USA cannot be disassociated from any discussion on how Europe can have a common defense policy and how Europe can stand on its own feet more again. And I think here is a real problem. It's a dilemma, and you see it exactly the same dilemma in the Far East, with Japan specifically, which is that the USA is in a late imperial moment. If they let go too fast, there'll be chaos. The longer they hang on to this system of dependency, the harder it will be for its dependents to stand on their own feet. And I don't have an answer to this, but perhaps Mr. de Hoop-Scheffer, who's more of an expert, does.
I'll try later, but I think we go first to Stefano to address the comments, and then Mary.
I think that on the mix, you know, I mean, the European Union is a credible soft power. I mean, we should need to agree and define it a bit, because it's not necessarily soft in the sense of light, soft in the sense of not deploying military means, not deploying threats. It's rather a sort of force of attraction, values, policies, instruments, money, you know, which has made us, in any case, a relevant actor, and more than relevant, an attractive actor. Because after all, in spite of all our difficulties and crises, we are still inspiring many in the world. We should not trumpet that and say, therefore, we are perfect. But simply, I would not throw it away too quickly. Now, we have entered, even recently with the European Council discussion, the defense discussion, the permanent relationship that we have set up with NATO, for example, which is a constant feature. The Secretary General invited regularly to our councils and vice versa. We have opened, obviously, the new chapter and say, look, we cannot go on that in this way. We have to build, we have to consolidate, we have to go farther than formula. But is that credible that the European Union is a reasonable future will become a real hard power? I don't think so. By the way, it's not necessarily hard power at EU level, meaning Brussels. It could be something which is much more, let's say, complex to set up. But this chapter has been open. I mean, the reason why in the global issue, in the global strategy, we need to say something which is giving the line in order to bring it forward. But I think that Stefan Füle was right in underlining a sort of midway, in reality, in advancing. And I think in our neighborhood, even if I think we have now to, let's say, redefine this, it's not a unified region. It's rather a constellation of interlocutors that we have to be able to capture in terms of interest. But it is true that is the new mix, probably, which is the right one, to find something which is based on our soft being as an actor, which is, as I described before, but also to be able to be a bit more assertive, to mobilize the means when we can do it, not maybe in the most known theater, it works. Let's think about Mali, let's think about Central African Republic, let's think all those theaters in which we are already mixing our presence in terms of development aid, in terms of military presence, in terms of civilian missions, in terms of way to assist these countries to do better by their own means. We can discuss it, but certainly we have examples on which we can work. So therefore, I think that this midway is something on which we have to work in practical terms. Now, I say that the discussion on values versus interest is something that on which I'm not comfortable at all, because it's not black and white. Because we have not to believe that we have to, to give up our values suddenly, because if we want to say this, we already did it. Because what we have done with all the dictators which are thrown out by the Arab Spring, one can say, well, you already solved this, because we had already intense relationship with this. Was this a policy made on our interest, not in values? Not at all. I think that we have to create maybe a new mix, but the most important thing is to understand which kind of value we compare with others. We have not to give up, but very often we were not listening to the values of the others, which has created difficulties, because too often we were seen in exporting values, suddenly not that in a soft way, in spite of the condition, but exporting our culture, imposing, giving for granted, but not listening to the other. I think that this is something which must change, but not changing our values, but our way of keeping them high, but also being able to understand the others. This is, I think, one of the most important issues that we have to deal, in particular, in our neighborhood.
Just very briefly on the question on Libya, and the question was, what did the war of the intervention in 2011 achieve? I think if you ask Libyans, many of them will admit that there was an element of what we can call naivety on the part of Libyans, but also some of the internationals post-revolution. I can remember on the ground in Libya hearing many Libyans say that within 5 or 10 years Libya will look like Dubai. That there's been a huge reality check in that respect. But I think now when Libyans talk about the current crisis and the unraveling of the last year, and of course, everybody knows that life in Libya now is much worse than it was before February 2011. But I think we should be careful not to interpret that as nostalgia for the old order. People say, yes, things are in a very, very bad state in Libya right now, but many of them still remain optimistic that things will change for the better in the future. So I think we need to be careful about interpreting the people's concerns about the crisis now for nostalgia and possibly regret for the intervention and the revolution more broadly in 2011. What I would like to return to, though, is that question of the neighbourhood policy and what a neighbourhood policy that is fit for purpose would look like. And I would like to draw actually on Ambassador Alawi, who in the session earlier today on Europe's global influence was quite critical of the neighbourhood policy and indeed said it had been long failing. And Ambassador, I would ask you, what in your view would be a neighbourhood policy that is fit for purpose at this present time?
All right, let me just say 2 lines on Ian's question on the United States of America, late imperial, reluctant hegemon. I think Obama made a crucial mistake in not enforcing his red line in Syria. That decision was duly noted in Beijing, was duly noted in Moscow, was duly noted by Vladimir Putin, without any doubt, when the commander-in-chief of the most powerful nation on the globe doesn't enforce his red lines. That led to a policy, by the way, of a change in 1 week of Assad should go to Assad should stay, because he should fulfill his promises on chemical weapons use. So that was such a 180 degrees turn of US foreign policy that up till now there is, in my view, exaggerating perhaps a bit for the sake of the discussion, there is not the beginning of a strategy in Washington. And there's hardly the beginning of a strategy, let me be friendly, in the European Union. As I said this morning, we don't talk to the Russians, we talk to the Iranians. We still say Assad should go, now we say Assad can stay a few weeks or a few months. Anyway, the fact that we do not have that strategy for Syria means that the refugee crisis, as a direct consequence of what's happening there, is even more complicated than it already was. And the reason that the United States of America are in this late imperial phase is exactly the reason that even as a former NATO Secretary General, I can imagine more and more scenarios, apart from Article 5 and massive land wars in Europe. That's of course NATO. And the European Union should not develop into a projection of hard power champion. But Mali, I think, quite honestly, Mali should have been, given the fact that this is Europe's neighborhood, this is Europe's back garden, should not have been done by the French unilaterally, should have been done by the European Union with the battle groups, but they were nowhere to be found, unfortunately, and now it's the UN. There was a question from Mary, and I would kick the ball now back to the floor. To whom you directed that question, Mary? Ambassador Alawi. Okay, here we go.
Well, if you allow me, I would like very briefly, to come back to initial. The whole Euro-Mediterranean partnership was based on the assumption more development in the south, less migration to the north from the very beginning. And we have to admit that this did not function properly, and that for some reason they were ill development and not the correct development, and that the youth in the Arab area across the region have huge expectations. And I just did say that before that, the neighbourhood policy came as a correction, and very much at the claims of Morocco as well, which was asking for more differentiated stance of the European Union, not to have this one-size-fits-all. But we have to admit that now we have experienced a huge change in the region, and that the policy is just not robust enough to address all the claims and all the changes that have been happening. So I think I have the impression, I'm under the impression that we're mixing two things. We are talking about the security implications of weak or lack of integration, and everybody knows that the policies, have been much more restrictive than integrative. All the European observers have been saying so. And we are mixing the problem of mixing soft power and hard power. Now we are in front of massive migration. Migration itself is not a new phenomenon. It's the massive aspect, which is assault in Europe, as I had said this morning, which is the new, and how to deal with it. So this is a new problem because we did not probably tackle, and I don't say it is the fault of Europe, that the issue of development and ill development has not been tackled properly, and we have millions of reasons in that. But we have to admit as well that the response to the Arab Springs have not been up to the expectations of the region and of the people. As I said, too little, too late. And I remember having a discussion with Catherine Ashton when we had, the problem in Tunisia, and she was promising $50,000, which were euros, which were not even given to meet the problems at that moment. So we do know the developments, afterwards. So neighborhood policy would not be enough to tackle the problem, because now, the challenges are huge, and there is a mix of security problem, ill development problem, social and lack of jobs problem. This is the problem. We need to give jobs to these young people who are really desperate, idle, and a prey to radicalisation. So what I would like very much to hear as well from the audience and from the European experts, what is being done to the counter-narrative to this extremism, and what are the prevention? I don't see it. It seems to me that in Europe, people are at a loss, whether be it European Union as such or the member states. They don't know how to address this claim for identity, and which is very, very badly when we had, this dialogue between cultures and things. We did stress the point with Mr. Prodi that these young people are young Europeans, but they don't feel Europeans because they are not treated as such as European citizens. So this is a huge problem. And they have lost the initial culture. They have lost, and they get it all biased through, because they have become the prey of radical preachers. They are the easy prey. They are idle, they are desperate, and there is the romantic side. We have seen a video in the French TV which was absolutely extraordinary. A young person, 13-year-old, telling to the little French, "You cowards, you have to become a man and come to wage war here." A 13-year-old boy addressing. So that's why we have a mix, of problems, you have really to try to identify and probably talk about things in different perspective, because the neighborhood policy is not going to address this problem of counter extremism here, but it certainly will help better development, not only in North Africa, but back, you know, in Africa. Because now in Morocco, we are facing the same problem with, you know, the problem of migration. And we are trying to have a generous policy, but as well, it is difficult because we don't have the tools. We have to invent everything, and we don't want to repeat the same problem because, you know, people say, well, Morocco has a generous policy immigration, so let's all go to Morocco. We don't have the means, you know, to receive these people. So I think that we have really to identify the issues and try to have tailor-made answers to each specific problem.
Thank you, Ambassador. Interesting challenge. I have Shada, and then I have two gentlemen here on my left, and then we go back to the. I see many other. Sure.
Three quick points. Our neighborhood is not just our neighborhood. Russia shares part of our neighborhood. Iran does, and Saudi Arabia does. And we haven't talked about Saudi Arabia and how Saudi Arabia's toxic Wahhabi Salafi extremist orthodox version of Islam is spreading through the region and beyond Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the rest. So I think if we don't talk about where that narrative is coming from, that would be a pity. I also want to stress just how much damage the EU's handling of the refugee crisis, the mishandling of the refugee crisis, how much damage that has done to Europe's reputation and global influence. If you talk to ASEAN countries and how badly they are handling their refugee crisis, the Rohingya crisis, we can't tell them what to do. No. We have no moral high ground, no moral authority left when we deal with these issues, when we talk to our Southeast Asian partners. And my third point is really integration, and I think Ian pointed to that. The need for inclusive, diversified integration policies. We don't have that. And there I would say that the EU has a role to play, because look at the EU institutions. Where is the diversity? You talk about diversity and they talk about women. That's fine. I'm all for women. But there is more to diversity than just gender. And I'd like to ask a question to Saliha, actually, about a point that Ian made about dysfunctional families and the role they play in perhaps attracting young people towards extremist ideology. Saliha, your experience, is it that the families are unable to cope with the children's aspirations, not just the outside society, but the families themselves? Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Please, you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. Nick Whitney from the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'd like to raise the subject, if I may, of the common security and defence policy. I know that even articulating the letters CSDP in today's Brussels feels a bit unreal or old-fashioned or possibly indecent, but we heard this morning that these massive displacements of people are giving us an existential challenge in Europe. We're all agreed that one of the things we have to do is try to do things in the countries of origin and transit. Now, I'm not leading up to the suggestion for an EU military intervention in Syria, but if Syria was solved tomorrow, we would still be facing the prospect of massive migration over the next 2-3 decades from across the Mediterranean, from Africa, where very clearly the demographic trends show that an extra 1 billion souls will be added to the population in the next 2 or 3 decades. It is massively in our European interest, it must be, to do whatever we can to ensure that the conditions of stability and prosperity are achieved in Africa, which enable them to sustain their own population rather than all these surplus folk trying to come north. In the old days, we used to know that development wasn't the answer to these things. Development had to go hand in hand with security, just as security had to go hand in hand with development. Africa is going to need not just development aid, investment, it's going to need help with dealing with the conflicts that rage from Sudan to Mali to Boko Haram, if we're not to continue to face this same refugee problem over 20 or 30 years. Mr. Manservisi mentioned what the EU is doing in Mali and Niger, but frankly, or the Central African Republic, I think, frankly, the presence we have on the ground in all those three places is token. As you yourself said, we failed to deploy battle groups to either the CAR or Mali when we might have done in 2013 and 14. We would prefer, it seems, to think that this is an issue which the UN and the African Union can look after. We can do a bit of capacity building and send them some money, but they can do the unpleasant business of actually trying to assist in peace processes. But they can't. It was very clear from the Leaders' Summit which Obama convened at the UN in September that the UN is unable to cope with the peacekeeping demands put upon them. And even in that context, the European response, 200 troops here, an engineer squadron there, was very low-key indeed. We used to do this stuff. In the old days, before Europeans lost their confidence, we used to pop down to Congo from time to time to restabilize the situation. We didn't solve it. But the Congo is a better place now than it might have been. So my question is there actually any hope for the CSDP? What do the panel think? Can we reactivate this tool of European foreign policy, or should we finally write its obituary?
Thanks very much, Nick. One question there. Yeah, okay, go ahead. Just a journalist, right?
Sorry?
Just a journalist.
Just
right?
a journalist.
Okay.
Still just a journalist. Haven't progressed since this morning, I'm afraid. I just want to question Stefano Manservisi saying that you know, our interests are now converging, and you know, we're really seeing. I'd be interested to know where our interests are converging, if you can give us some examples. My perception is twofold. On the one hand, that our common foreign policy or common approaches to foreign policy challenges only work when one large member state takes the lead. It was Germany in Ukraine, it was France in Mali, for a while it was France and Britain in Libya, but when they dropped the ball, nobody else picked it up. In Turkey, it's not perhaps quite the same, but again, one sees quite a big German hand. But I'm not sure that I see European member states' interests being thrashed out and turned into a common interest by the External Action Service, which is what I'd always hoped it would do. Maybe it's still early years, but you know, we've had a few now. So that's my first question. My second thing is on the neighbourhood policy. Aren't we in fact seeing the new neighbourhood policy emerging in practice even before it's emerged in theory in the relationship with Turkey? Sorry, what we do with Turkey I think will sort of define what we do elsewhere. We're seeing that we're having to hold our nose and do business with Mr. Erdogan. That means that we are having to lower our ambitions for transforming Turkish society, which were relatively lowered anyway by our reluctance to consider Turkey as a potential member. And therefore, it'll be up to the Turks in Turkish time to transform Turkish society, and relations with Europe may help, but that we're not going to mortgage our bigger interests, our bigger fish to fry with Turkey, to the transformation of Turkish society to correspond to our values. So just a couple of questions there.
For the gender balance, finally, please.
Thank you. Pauline Massart with Friends of Europe and the Europe's World Group. Bit of a follow-up on Nick's question, in fact. We've heard a lot today about Europe being constantly reactive rather than proactive. A lot of us would agree that we have some very good intelligence services in Europe. I wonder if the new security strategy is going to include an element or an item on a real European capability in intelligence, analysis and forecasting. Would we be able to use existing instruments? Would we need to create new mechanisms? After all, if we want common actions, we need common decisions and thus common analysis. So I wonder what the thinking is within the European External Action Service.
Thank you so much, Pauline. We go to Salia first on Shada's question, and there was also a question about the counter-narrative, and then we go to the other panel members. And I should inform you that at 5:15 sharp, we have to stop and end this session because of the arrival of His Majesty. Salia.
Thank you. The radicalization of my son was very, very quick. It happened in 3 months. And the problem with families who are concerned with this situation, it's that first they don't really know about religion, about Islam. And when your son come back at home and say, you know, this is not the good way to do with our religion, with Islam, I learned that we have to do that and that. And what's happened, it's that we didn't find support from religious leadership, like imams in mosque. And when my son tried to get this information about Islam in the mosque, they told him that he's welcome only just for prayer and then go out, because they have no time and no space to teach the religion to our children. And what's happened in this time, it's that there are predicators outside, extremist predicators outside, and they tell to our children that they have time for them, that they have space to talk about religion for them. And what's happened after that, my son felt unwell and he stopped with school, he stopped with sport, because he said that he felt more and more discrimination and racism in his own school. And he said, it's enough. I'm 18, I have the right to stop with school. I have no opportunity to do something that I would like to do here in Europe, in Belgium. And I will try to find my place with brothers. And these brothers, those brothers were extremely dangerous, because it was an extremism network in our town, in Vilvoorde, and we are just parents, and we hope we try to. In this time, I didn't know about recruiters, about radicalization. I just listened in the media that something's wrong happened with young people. They went to Syria, but that's it. And but what I can say today is, in this time, I felt that something wrong happened with my son. I try to discuss about this with my family and with Muslims friends, and what they answers to me, it's just, what are you saying? It's our religion. They don't want to be critique about this discussion. And now what we have to do for the counter-narrative, I think it just, in my position, I can just go in the schools and talk with young people about the disaster after the extremism manipulation, and to inform parents that religion, Islam, is not to choose to go and die for this cause. We can help people, we can do something to help other communities and society and stay alive. And voila, that's it.
Thank you so much.
And turning to you, Ian, that question of crafting a counter-narrative that is powerful enough to challenge the propaganda we're seeing coming from ISIS and their ilk. Who could craft such a counter-narrative? Who should craft such a counter-narrative? Because isn't there a difficulty here that if such counter-narrative comes from, say, the top down, if it's something that smacks of government counter-narrative, then it simply doesn't have any credibility, and you actually don't reach the people you want to reach?
Well, that's assuming that it's simply a matter of narratives, which I'm skeptical about. I mean, responding to the ambassador, I think, remarks, unfortunately, it's not always the desperate or the poor or the uneducated people who turn to violence. On the contrary, it's often, if you look at the 9/11 perpetrators, if you look at the killer of Theo van Gogh, if you look at the underground bombers in London, they're usually the relatively well-educated and relatively Europeanized boys who tend to do this, because the disillusion for them, for whatever reason, the rejection from a girlfriend, they couldn't get a job, whatever it is all the greater. It's the raised expectations theory of revolution. And so the answer is not necessarily more education. Diversity, yes, but I think the one practical thing, just to repeat, is that the job market has to be improved to integrate people. And I'll give you one example in one country, but I single out France. France is not the only country where they have this problem. In France, and I can't remember the exact year when it was, but there were big riots in the banlieue. Not just Muslims, it was people, all kinds of people in the banlieue who were very mixed. Sorry? 2005. I think it was the day before, or a few days before, that there was a big demonstration in Paris of students, elite students, who were demonstrating against the government trying to give companies the right to fire their employees. The two are very linked, because it was not lost on these kids in the banlieue that what those students were demonstrating for made it more difficult for them to get employed.
Maybe I think when I describe situational process, I carefully use my word in indicating that there are steps into a direction and avoiding carefully to say that's done or over. Because unfortunately in our work, including the one of the European Union, we have to be able to analyze trends and to be able to capitalize on each step, because otherwise it would be too easy. Therefore, I didn't say that there is convergence all the time. I simply said that the narrative, which is insisting on the fact that there is no common foreign policy and that there are 28 or even 29 foreign policy, is factually not true, or at least not true as it used to be 10 years ago. Few examples. You know, what was the dividing line among my member states in the post-Crimea was the relation with Russia. Were we able to set up sanctions, to keep sanctions, to keep a relatively united line vis-à-vis this big neighborhood, which is Russia, yes or no? And the response is yes, and this was not easy. And from this, we have drawn a certain number of political action. Then, I have to say also that in spite of all the criticisms, which are perfectly fair, by the way, on the Normandy format, you know, the Normandy format has been supported regularly by all discussion in the Foreign Affairs Council. And the Normandy format would have produced strictly nothing if not knowing that it was fully embedded in discussion which were federating 28 member states. Then, you know, the appearance and the fact that France and Germany were around in order to set the scene is fine, and certainly correct, it's certainly true. But I would like to say that if we have to examine the trend, this has been an operation which has been driven, but more, not fully, but more European unity spirit than 10 years ago. Same thing is in respect of other cases. For example, Bosnia. Bosnia was the certain moment brought by two countries to the Foreign Affairs Council to say, look, the country is falling apart, therefore we have to invent shortcuts in order to be committed for enlargement. Immediately stopped by other member states, say, no, what we're talking about, this is not possible. Then we try to do what? To take out of what was the position of these two countries, which was essentially to use a process in order to sustain the still existence of the state, basically, and to put back of track the government in order to use the enlargement objective as a unifying it. This, after intense discussion, by the way, also intense interinstitutional work with some innovation, has brought at the end a common position which has used enlargement not to create shortcuts, but to create a united position vis-à-vis Bosnia, hopefully a bit also vis-à-vis Fyrom, which is in a similar, even worse situation. And therefore, we were able at least to federate around this the action of the 28. I can say in Syria it is extremely difficult, extremely painful. I say hardly to believe that there could be 28 voices, but I hardly believe that each of them is presenting a solution or a decent foreign policy. We are setting up something which is very difficult, because everybody agrees that we have to fight against Daesh, that in this some form of, let's say, interaction with the regime is not forbidden. By the way, is not forbidden since a while, because otherwise also the bombing of some of our powerful allies up to now would have not been possible. And then in the political transition, we start talking about the political transition. But why the European Union has been able to say something, allow me to say something, and not to set the scene? Because we were instrumental in reaching the agreement with Iran on the nuclear deal. And precisely because we were important, if not exclusive, but important, let's say, to facilitate. In the last days of this negotiation, there were more side meetings around Syria than about the Iranian deal in itself, because these were creating precisely the condition of thinking about something. Therefore, few examples, but simply to get out from the mantra either or. You know, either it's fully at the European Union level, or by definition there are 28 conflicted. No, the situation is much more complex. If we look at the real interests which are defining foreign policy, the convergence is higher if we are able to build on this. If we are able to create a condition for something which is unifying. Second point, it is about migration and refugee. You know, I think the normal say is, we are flooded. I think that it is worth and decent, intellectually at least, if not politically, because it's not manageable, that the big flows of migration are still south-south. And if you look at the numbers, which are published every year by IOM, by the UN, you'll see that those which are reaching the European Union are just a small fraction of what is going on in the rest of the world. Is not to diminish the importance of the problem, on the contrary. Is not to diminish the challenge that we have in terms that were defined before, but at least it would be useful for opinion makers to work with facts and figures, because this is important. I said that sometimes it's difficult to present the European Union position to poor countries with which we are seeking cooperation, because they have to help us, Niger, Ethiopia, others. When they are presenting a situation where in Niger there are 100,000 refugees, I said in Ethiopia several hundred thousand of refugees, and so on and so forth. And leave aside the 2 million and more in Turkey, which, and I fully agree, is a bit the mirror in which our credibility in our external action must be tested. We have been, for the last 2 years, pretending not to see what was going on in Turkey, basically, as long as they were keeping. We did something similar in Morocco also, by the way, until the moment when the bubble is blowing up. And therefore, we find ourselves with people at the border. I think that we have to manage this border, but we have to manage also the reasons why we didn't, anticipate a bit, and the tools to do the only rational thing to do, to believe that these people, or the vast majority of these people, will remain with us. And therefore, it's better to start investing in what Ian said, right policies of integration of labour market and transformation ourselves, because everybody knows that not only these people will remain, but these people are largely also an asset, if well integrated. If not, is a problem. And if not, there could be other examples of what has been said, which are dramatic, because the result of two elements, one external, but then the failure of ourselves internally. This, I think, is something which must be considered.
Thank you so much. No time for a wrap-up. I feel relieved. Thank you all very much, my co-panelists and you, for participating in this discussion. I think the message for all of us, as we're sitting in this Arenberg room here, is that we realize we are the elite, and that we have a huge responsibility, in my opinion, to connect with the European citizen. And there, up till now, we have largely failed, if you see what's happening, because we can agree, we can disagree, we can comfort each other as an elite. We know what's best. But as soon as the herd doesn't follow us, we still have a major problem. And that is not only relevant for migration, for asylum, but for almost all the subjects we have discussed. Once again, a warm thanks to my co-panelists. And I'll now give it back to the organizers so that we can prepare for the final and closing session. Thank you all very much.